From the Studio 13 Studios in Splendora, Texas.
Well, good morning, Montgomery County. This is my second podcast of the Montgomery County Water Level. And last week, our last podcast, we basically Hank and I did a level setting, I guess you want to call it. We talked a little bit and framed the problem and all of that kind of stuff. And one of the things that came out of the last podcast that I thought that's really important for everybody to keep their eye on is the complexity of this thing. So, you know, to a lot of people, this water thing is really simple. It seems really simple, but it's not simple at all. And one of the things I kept hearing was this notion of something called a differential. And so, you know, I've studied it a little bit, and it's really an important thing for people to recognize. So this morning on the show this morning, I've asked John Sellers, who is a financial guy and who has done a lot of work on this notion of differential, to come and be my guest and explain that, because I think it's important that people understand, and this will give you an idea of the complexity that goes into all of this. Before we get to talking about it, though, I'd like to introduce John. John is a guy I've known for quite a while. Some of you may know him. He ran for the Willis School Board, so you may have seen John Sellers signs somewhere. I thought John had the best debate line I've heard in a long time in one of the debates he did. Somebody asked him about this notion of, I think it was social justice or
equity,
and I'll let you. What was your answer when they said, "What do you think about social equity?" or whatever it was?
Oh, I just told him I thought the idea was complete garbage, that it goes against the principles of merit and has no place in our school system.
Yeah, and it drew a standing ovation. So John is not a neophyte to controversy and all kinds of other things, and John has been helping the Stecker Corporation with this water issue for quite a while. And with that, I'm gonna let John introduce himself, tell you a little more about him, and then we'll get into this notion of differential.
All right. Well, thanks, Jim, and I appreciate the invitation. I'm excited to be on. Is this the second?
Second one, man.
The second one. All right.
You're actually the first out. You're the first real guest.
Okay.
I don't consider Hank a guest.
Wow, I'm honored.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Jim, no, I've been kind of involved with groundwater going back some 23 years. As a sophomore at Texas A&M, I was interning at a news radio station in Navasota, Texas.
Wow.
One of my first assignments was covering the Bluebonnet Groundwater Conservation District. Went to its very first inaugural meeting.
Yeah. Wow.
Way back when.
Can I stop you real quick?
Yeah,
I want to
sure.
give Bluebonnet a plug.
Okay.
I actually had a great meeting, and our consultants had a great meeting with Bluebonnet. We're working on the groundwater GMA 14 model we're going to use for planning, and Bluebonnet has really been very cooperative and a big help in that. And I want to do a special shout out to Zach and Bill, Zach is the general manager and Bill is their consultant. So,
Okay.
Anyway, go ahead. I
Yeah,
didn't mean to
great
interrupt
folks
you.
here in Grimes County
Yeah,
and Brazos
yeah.
Valley. But yeah, that was my first exposure into this idea of groundwater. I mean, you did never think that, you know, as a kid growing up, it's not something you pay a lot of attention to. Anyways, kind of went through my career as a radio journalist or reporter, and somehow wound up in public accounting, where I was again kind of faced with this whole GRP, groundwater conservation, in the form of doing financial audits for several cities here in Montgomery County that were part of the SGRA lawsuits, mainly Splendora, the city of Magnolia, the city of Conroe. So you had to kind of delve into those lawsuits and get to understand them so that you can write the proper notes to the financial statement, outline the liabilities and the different moving parts. So I kind of got some exposure there. I left public accounting, I believe, in 2017. I started working for the Chamber of Commerce in Conroe, and was a big issue there. And so we did a lot of programming type issues related to the GRP, the SGRA, and just general groundwater. Are we running out of water yet? Those kind of topics.
Yeah. So you're not a neophyte at this at all. You've been involved in this quite a bit.
Yeah, I've got a long and storied past. I feel like I've read extensively on the issue,
Yeah,
and I've got a pretty good idea of what's going on.
Well, it's a very important topic for a couple of reasons. One, it could be the limiter to growth in Montgomery County if we're not careful. I've heard all kinds of projections. We'll be at 200,000 acre feet of water, groundwater by the year 2040, 2045, and 400,000 necessary acre feet, no matter where it comes from,
Right.
by 2080. And that's we're at 75,000 now, so you can sort of see the
How we get there.
how we get there is really important. So one, where do we get it and how do we get there? But number two, what's the cost of it? And I've said this over and over in public. When I was in Magnolia, I was getting $750 a month water bills because of the GRP issue. And then I heard this term differential, and I had no idea what was meant by that, because I thought I understood the water situation. When I was right when I said people see this really very simplistically, and it's not as simplistic as it sounds. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you. What do we mean when we say differential? And then talk a little bit about how that plays into the cost and the way the SJRA and the GRPs actually price this stuff and do all this. So
Okay. Well, the differential, sort of in a nutshell, and I'm going to do my best to explain it. You're right. It is a complicated issue.
it is.
But you have this groundwater reduction program or project that's set up by the St. John River Authority, and it's essentially funded by two different revenue streams. All right, you have the actual fee per gallon of treated surface water delivered, which is a rate. Sorry to confuse it, I said fee, but it's really a rate for 1,000 gallons of treated surface water delivered.
So this is the water out of Lake Conroe.
Correct. This is the treated surface water.
All right.
And it primarily goes to the city of Conroe, and it goes to several areas, mainly the Woodlands water down in South County. And there's a couple other muds that get it. There's a place, Mid-South Electric Cooperative has a CCN there off of Fish Creek Thoroughfare. They're getting surface water as well. So I think in all there's either 6 or 7 right now, 7 entities that are currently hooked up surface water. So that's one revenue stream that the GRP is funded by. The other is a fee for 1,000 gallons of water pumped by a large volume user. And so what you've got is these
Now, what is a large volume user? What is that?
A large volume user is going to be somebody that uses a lot of groundwater, either to resell or for some sort of industrial purpose. I forget the exact.
10 million gallons.
10 million gallons a year will distinguish you as a large volume pumper user.
And then for those who want to try to make more sense out of that, because 10 million gallons, I can't get my head wrapped around that. That basically equates to 71 residential homes.
Correct. So it would be a small water system would pretty much put you in that qualification.
Right.
The water company that I work for, Woodland Oaks, to put that in perspective, we have about 1,500 connections. So that's roughly 1% of the size of us. They would still qualify as a large volume user or pumper. But going back to the differential, so you've got these two rates or fees. You've got a rate for the groundwater delivered, and then you've got a rate that's paid for pumpage. All right?
Wait a minute, surface water delivered.
Surface water delivered.
A rate for surface water delivered. So I'm getting my water from the SJRA, basically.
Correct.
And then whatever I pump out of the ground,
you're paying a fee for
I'm
that.
paying a fee for that to the SJRA.
And the idea around that is, even though you're not as a person who's not hooked up to groundwater, even though we're not receiving the groundwater, we still get the benefit of the reduced pumping that the major pumpers are not having to pump. So that's kind of the argument.
Now, why would it matter?
Well,
I mean, why would it matter that somebody uses surface water so I don't have to pump more groundwater? Why would that matter that I don't have to pump more groundwater?
it's some kind of a trade-off. And in the beginning, there was kind of like a credit system set up to where essentially everybody in the beginning was supposed to reduce their pumpage by 30%.
So the reduction rule is why
Right. It comes
mattered.
into play. Mhm.
Okay. And the reduction rule was put in place for what reason? Do you know?
Well, apparently it was thought at one time that we were running out of water here in this county. I think that most of the recent science is saying that that's not necessarily the case.
Right. Okay. So
Even though
the reduction rules that Lone Star put in place created a shortage, if you will, of groundwater. So surface water came in, and in order for you to get for some of you to keep pumping groundwater, other people went on to surface water, but the people who got to pump groundwater had to pay for that privilege then.
correct.
Okay.
And so what the differential really was in the beginning, it was a way to talk a lot of these strictly groundwater participants into signing on to the GRP contract, because they had to be able to look these people in the eye and say, we're going to charge the people who are getting surface water more than what you're paying to pump 1,000 gallons, simply to make up for the fact that they are foregoing or at least being able to defer some type of cost to increase their production capacity. And the whole controversial topics that you get in this is how to calculate that differential. What cost do you look at specifically?
So I got lost a little bit in that. Let's go
Yeah,
back.
it gets complicated.
Well, no, it is. It's very complicated. And I don't want people to get lost in this. So when you talk about that differential, so you're going to charge me a little bit more to make up for the fact that I get to pump the groundwater? Is that what you were saying?
No, the people that are actually receiving the treated surface water
Right.
pay more per 1,000 gallons of that water than a
Groundwater
strictly
user.
groundwater user
And
pays
is that
in
because
their
the
pumpage
increased
fees.
cost of treating it?
That is because it's a benefit. They're actually receiving the water.
Yeah.
So they're not having to expend
double.
expend the extra resources that it takes to pump that water.
All right. So if I'm on surface water, and let's assume it's $1, and groundwater would only be 50 cents. So I'm paying a 50% premium,
Right, and that
Because-
would be the differential,
and
which
that's the differential.
be that
so-
50 cents.
Okay, so that sounds really simple to me. So what's the controversy about differential then?
Well, why and how? What's your reasoning for setting that differential at 50 cents? Why did you just pull that number out of thin air? Or is there actual science and studies behind it to represent it? And so that's kind of where it becomes complicated. It also
Well, does the differential, then it sounds to me like, John, and this is where people get confused, I believe, is so it costs me $1 to make to treat the surface water. That's what I'm charging you, right?
Mhm.
And the other guy, it cost him 50 cents to pump it. So
Well, let's go back, Jim, because that dollar that you're being charged for surface water,
yeah,
well, that 1,000 gallons for the $1 you're paying actually costs about 3 times more than that. And so the cost of that treated surface water is actually being offset by the pumpage fees. That's the only way this whole thing works.
okay, so let's stop a minute. Let's make sure everybody's clear on that.
All
So the dollar really ought to be $3.
That is closer to the true
Okay,
cost
so
to produce.
I don't know what it actually, but to make a point, it's a lot more,
It's a lot more, yes.
right? So instead of charging the guy who's getting the surface water the $3, we charge the pumpage fee to the guy who's getting the groundwater to offset that $3.
Correct.
So that guy doesn't have to pay $3, and this guy pays 50 cents. So and now this guy's paying $1.50 or whatever, the groundwater guy, in addition to the 50 cents that he's or she is paying their water producer. So if I'm sitting over here in a neighborhood that's being furnished by Woodland Oaks, and Woodland Oaks it's costing Woodland Oaks 50 cents to sell me the water.
Right.
Now Woodland Oaks has to charge me $1.50 for that water in order to pass that on to the SJRA to make up for the loss it's taking on every gallon it pumps to the individual and only charges $1. Does that sound right?
Right. It's what they're doing is they're taking essentially a very expensive item to produce, which is this treated surface water. They're trying to spread the cost out among as many people as they can, because the smaller the cost is, the fewer people, will realize it and complain about it, and everybody can go on their merry way. The problem is, the closer you get into this GRP issue, is that there's a very small amount of total entities. I think the last count there were a little over 80 overall GRP participants, yet only
89, I think.
Yeah, 89. That might be the
Something
right
like
number.
that. Yeah.
It's up there though.
Yeah.
And the number of entities that are actually receiving groundwater is 6. And so you have this sort of discontent all over the rest of the county among these people that are not getting the surface water. They feel like
They're subsidizing.
Right, they're subsidizing something that's not really benefiting them. And I can understand that.
Or they don't feel like it's benefiting them.
Right.
But the argument on the other side is it is benefiting them because they get to keep pumping. If in fact we had to reduce by 30%, it's allowing them to continue to use their cheaper source.
Right.
So instead of getting the full value of the cheaper source, they're still getting some value out of that by helping subsidize those people who would be paying a really astronomical amount.
Correct.
Okay.
So
Now but I still hear a lot of controversy about the differential, and something you said earlier is, how do we get that different? How do we actually know?
Right. Well, and it's very the main guidance we have to go off of how the differential is set is in the GRP contract. The wording is very, very vague, and I think that was done so purposefully. But essentially, the wording says that the GRP has the right to come in and adjust the rate differential from time to time. That's the literal language in it. So there's very few sort of rules in there regarding this differential. But essentially, the differential was a shot at fairness to essentially sort of try to entice the people that were not going to be getting surface water to sign on to the GRP contract, because they were saying, look, nobody is going to be either given a benefit nor penalized for receiving surface water. And so that was the general concept. Where it gets complicated and where there's a lot of controversy is that the way that the differential, the methodology behind it, how it's set up, is what particular cost of producing water do you look at to know how to set the differential. And
so this is where an accounting guy, a real finance guy like
Right.
you, comes in. Okay.
And so there's different methodologies that you can use. And like I said in the contract, it's kind of vague. So they have a lot of leeway to sort of set that up. But something that I think is glaring at a lot of people is that you have the San Jacinto River Authority who is administrating this GRP. A dirty little secret is that the SGRA itself has another division called the Woodlands Division that manages and serves as operator for, I believe, 11 MUDs in South County in and around the Woodlands, who are in fact the GRP's largest customer and the largest receivers of treated surface water. And so you could make the argument.
So the Woodlands Water Agency
Right.
is an arm of
The San Jacinto River Authority, or the San Jacinto River
they're the
Authority.
deliverer of
They're the operator, and essentially manage a lot of the aspects of the water system.
And
down
how
in
much
South
of the
County.
surface water going to the Woodlands goes through the Woodlands Water Agency?
How much of the surface water?
Yeah, so if
I'd say all of the surface water that goes, into the
comes
woodlands.
down to the Woodlands,
Right.
goes through the Woodlands Water Agency. Okay, and so go back and tell me the relationship between the Woodlands Water Agency.
The Woodlands Water Agency was set up, I believe, in the late 1970s when the Woodlands was originally being developed, and they contracted with the San Jacinto River Authority at that time
Be the
to
deliverer.
be the operator. They essentially do all the maintenance. They drill the wells. I believe they have ownership of the wells.
They do.
That are down
38
there,
of
but they serve all of these municipal utility districts that are down there with water and sewer.
And are they the actual GRP? Are they? They're not the GRP owner then, are they? It's still the SJRA that owns the GR is the GRP.
The SGRA, they own the surface water treatment plant, and they own the lines in the ground going 13
But
miles.
who owns the GRP?
The GRP?
Or who's managing the?
Yeah, the GRP is a division of the San Jacinto River Authority.
Now, are there other GRPs besides the one the SJRA manages?
Yeah, there's one, for example, a subsidence district in Harris County that acts in a lot of ways like a GRP. There was
But I mean, in Montgomery County, are there any other GRPs? I think there are some
there
smaller ones,
there was one, I believe, up in the Porter area.
like Porter Sud.
Yeah, Porter Sud. That's
Yeah.
the other one that I can think of. It was a pretty small operation, and I don't know a whole lot about it, to be honest with you. Other than
Okay,
there
now
was
let's go
another
back
one.
to the dirty secret. So what's the dirty secret again?
Well, in the audit world, you would call it a conflict of interest, and that means that you're kind of having some financial dealings with yourself because the SGRA has a role as what's supposed to be a neutral sort of third-party administrator. Yet on the other hand, they themselves are their own largest customer in this huge cost-sharing plan that has become the GRP and managing the surface water treatment plant, and it results in close to $60 million a year out of the local economy. And so it's become a pretty big part of what's happening in Montgomery County financial-wise. It hits a lot of people pretty hard in their pocketbook when they pay their water bills.
So if I understand it right, the SJRA is the GRP
Administrator.
administrator. One of their GRP members is the Woodlands Water Agency, who is an arm of them,
Correct.
and who is their largest customer.
For treated surface water.
Now, how is that?
Well,
Okay,
it incentivizes the SGRA in and of itself to keep that differential lower because their customers benefit from a lower,
meaning the pumpage
differential.
fees to the other people are higher.
right, they'd rather see lower treated surface water fees and higher pumpage fees.
Because it doesn't affect their major customer, and
Right.
it goes in their pocket. Is that accurate? So in reality, the less surface water that the SJRA sells, especially in the woodlands, the more profit they make. Is that accurate?
No, I'd say the more groundwater that's pumped, the more profit
That's
the
what I mean. The
SGRA
less
makes.
surface water that
Right.
they sell,
Surface
the
water
more
is very
profit they make
expensive to
because
produce.
the rest of it's groundwater produced at a lower rate with the differential tacked onto it.
Right. So
Does
That's-
anybody know what the differential ought to be?
So I've heard right now it's said, I believe, at 42 cents.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of controversy going around because apparently when the SGRA first set out to do a differential, they commissioned a study that came back and said that back then, I believe it was 2014, the differential should have been 42 cents. For whatever reason, the SGRA board saw fit to make it 19 cents.
Okay.
And so for several years, we went on in this GRP where the differential was only 19 cents.
Meaning the pumpage fees to the groundwater people were even higher.
No, the surface water treatment the rate for 1,000 gallons of surface water was 19 cents higher than the fee for groundwater pumpage was.
Okay.
And the reason they said, like I said, you're not supposed to be penalized nor benefited. So they're essentially saying that it was essentially these people receiving treated surface water were saving 19 cents on the cost of what it would have otherwise costed them to produce the same amount of groundwater instead of the treated surface
So
water.
are you saying the 19 cents might not have been accurate? And why would they have made that so small then?
Well, they made it so small because, well, we don't know why they went against the study that they had commissioned that said it ought to be at 42 cents.
But what would be the difference between making it 19 and making it 42?
Well,
What's
obviously,
the consequence to me, the user?
to the user,
Yeah. So let's assume I'm outside the woodlands in a private subdivision being serviced by Woodland
sure.
Hills. what difference does it make to me whether they set it at 42 or 19?
Well, obviously, I mean, to you, the individual, you're going to be paying the pass-through fee regardless.
Right, but
Even
what's
though
the
you're
difference
not
between
getting
the
the
19 and the 42?
The 19 and the 42 essentially would ease the burden on some of the groundwater pumpers and shift it over to those that are actually receiving treated
So if the
surface
differential
water.
were higher or lower, it would shift the burden.
If the differential were higher, it would shift the burden to those receiving.
So if it's lower, I'm having to pay more as a private water user.
Yes, you could argue that, definitely.
Yeah, so let's just assume I set it at 19 instead of 42. That means I could be paying an additional on my pumpage fees, an additional 20 cents over what I should have been had it been set at 42.
Possibly.
Okay, so that's what I was saying. The reason to set the differential lower is so that your customers over here who are taking surface water get subsidized at even a higher rate.
Correct. And that's the general argument, and that's kind of why there's controversy, especially when you take into consideration what I see as a pretty big conflict of interest with the SGRA itself being its own largest customer and the largest,
Huge motivation to keep
right,
that differential.
and they're essentially incentivized to keep this differential at a lower level than probably what it should be. One of the reasons for that is that I'm, this little water company, and we're pumping groundwater. We're not getting any surface water. We're still coming out of pocket to increase our capacity to serve our customers' demand. We're in a growing area.
So you're having to drill another well, you're having to
Right.
increase horsepower,
Exactly.
drop your well deeper, whatever.
Whereas those that are receiving the treated surface water are able to increase their capacity without any additional capital being expended. And that's
Which is not an good equalization.
right, and it's not, it's not considered at all when they're looking at these differential calculations on how they come up with what it is.
So the differential calculation doesn't take into effect that the surface water is a fixed cost, basically. If I'm going to add more people to the GRP, I'm having to spend money to do that
right.
in a different way than the surface water people are if they add people. Now, doesn't it cost more to treat more surface water? I mean, per
does.
person.
It does.
So I've got a plant over there that's capable, let's assume the plant's capable of treating 100 gallons a day. And it's only treating 30 gallons a day.
Mm-hmm.
How much more does it cost? Because the plant's already there and it's capable.
Right.
How much more does it cost to treat 50 gallons a day versus, I know the pumps have got to run, you might have to put an additional pump on.
The way I understand it is the biggest cost involved is something, they call it GAC, or granulated activated carbon. Right. And it's, it's essentially charcoal that they have to bring in and out.
It's how they filter it.
Right. And that's the most, it's got a life. It'll only be able to treat so many gallons. And so that's the main cost, I believe, involved with running, of increasing production from the surface water treatment plant.
But that should not increase the cost per person per gallon, really, because, I mean, the activated carbon lasts longer if you're treating 30 gallons a day than at 50, but you're also collecting a different level of revenue on 30 versus 50. So I can make an argument that the fixed cost doesn't change.
But that's the thing, though, Jim. The people that are paying for the treated surface water are not paying the actual cost to treat that surface water. They're paying a highly subsidized cost that's offset by all the groundwater fees.
Okay, so let's not, I don't want to throw rocks at anybody.
Sure.
So how do they figure this differential? Who does that?
So
how do we know that that's accurate?
What they did most recently was they took 3 different GRP participants. They took themselves, the Woodlands Water.
Okay.
They took City of Conroe, and then they took another mud that was connected to surface water.
Okay.
And they did a cost survey, and they were only looking at very specific costs.
Can you give me some examples?
That would be costs like electricity to run the pumps to produce groundwater. And so what they were trying to do was trying to get a weighted average cost per 1,000 gallons of essentially cost savings to those receiving surface water. So if I'm receiving 1,000 gallons of surface water as opposed to pumping it, I'm saving on electrical costs, on storage costs, some maintenance costs. And so that's what the differential was supposed to represent. However, like I said earlier, it doesn't capture all of the cost, and that's why some of the primarily groundwater participants have a problem with it, is because there's no consideration for capital outlay to increase capacity to serve your customers. And that's the main benefit.
Which puts the private water user
at a disadvantage.
A financial disadvantage,
Correct.
economic disadvantage. And it seems to me like it actually makes the customer of that even more burdened.
Mm-hmm.
So shifts more of the burden to them and less to the surface water.
And that's what it was designed to do from the
Yeah,
outset.
yeah.
This was supposed to be a large project shared by many. And the cost has crept up there enough to where enough people like you and me, who have $500 and $700 water bills, get their fill of it pretty quick. And, once you kind of, look under the hood of this GRP, you see the way that was set up, and there's some problematic issues, especially when it comes to these conflict of interest and these little minute issues like the differential that are very, very subtle. And, unless somebody actually points it out to you, this is, how they're getting away with that. It's not something you would easily notice. But when you know that, a lot of the people down there in the Woodlands, it's one of the most affluent areas of Montgomery County.
And they're paying the lower water
And
bills,
they're
actually.
paying the lower.
Yeah, I've talked to multiple friends of mine who live in the Woodlands who are paying $60 and $70 and $90 water bills, even $100 ones. And at the same time, up here in Magnolia, and I don't have all the benefits of the Woodlands.
Right.
And I was paying a $700 a month water bill, and it just seemed to me that the cost of this thing was not, which is one of the problems, is that the cost was not equally shared. And it also seemed to me like this differential was one way. If somebody could figure this differential thing out and really balance it, truly balance it, it would make a heck of a difference in people's perceptions about the value of that water plant over there and whether it's worth actually utilizing. Because I think it is, but I just think you can't continue with this. I live in the Woodlands, and I've got sprinklers in my yard, I've got a swimming pool, and I'm paying $100 a month, and the guy over in Magnolia who's buying water from whoever has a swimming pool and sprinklers in their yard, and they're paying $500 and $600 and $700 a month for the same amount of water. Only the difference is that 50% of the water being used in the Woodlands is surface water, and I'm all grass, so I don't get any of it. And the burden is being put on me in a much bigger way than the burden is being put on those who are actually using it.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to give anybody the wrong idea. I don't think there's that big of a difference in the spread versus somebody in the Woodlands and somebody versus in Magnolia. What I can tell you is that if it's not for the guy in Magnolia splitting the cost of the treated surface water with the guy in the Woodlands water bill is going to be, 9 times as higher as it is right now.
Right.
And so,
but right now it looks like it's the guy that's getting the groundwater is 3 times higher than the Woodlands guy. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about we ought to. I understand the concept, and I don't totally disagree with it. I think there was a better way to go at it than the GRP mechanism. I don't want to get.
well, it's just the whole concept that you're paying for something and not receiving a benefit or a
well,
realizable benefit.
Well, or the benefits are not equal,
Right.
right? So if I'm living in the Woodlands and I'm paying a $90 water bill and I'm using the same amount of water as the guy in Magnolia's using, and the guy in Magnolia's wholesale water cost, the water he would be paying would be $150 from a private water supplier, but now it's $300 or $400, and the guy in the Woodlands still gets to continue to pay the $100. That's not an equitable way to share this at all. I mean, I understand the concept.
Well, and that's the thing. You have these different, say the guy in Magnolia is hooked up to a investor-owned utility or an IOU, as they're called.
Right.
Those costs are going to be different, and there might be fewer customers to spread around those costs. So he might be paying a higher rate and then paying an exorbitant, SGRA pass-through fee on top of it. Whereas in the woodlands, it's more densely populated. There's a lot of people on those water systems down there. They all get to share their own costs and probably land at a lower water bill.
But let's go back to the individual for a second.
Okay.
It doesn't really matter to the guy. It really doesn't matter to the family who's trying to raise their kids what the deal is. It's that we ought to have a way, there ought to be a way where that differential does not subsidize the surface water people to the level that it is now. Seems to me like that's a big PR issue. That's an obstacle that stands in the way of people really wanting to put their shoulder to figuring out how do we equitably have enough water for everybody at a good price.
Well, Jim, you didn't realize we had socialism here in Montgomery County?
Do what?
You didn't realize we had socialism here in Montgomery County? Because that's essentially the system they've set up. Is to where you've got one segment or one geographic area of this county that does have some subsidence issues. I'll give them that. And they saw, down there in the woodlands that they were having those issues, and that's kind of what spawned this whole thing. The thing is, the whole rest of the county doesn't seem to have a lot of those issues or groundwater.
But let's just be real clear here. This didn't start out as subsidence. It started out as we're running out of water.
You're right.
And when that dog wouldn't hunt anymore, when the Texas Water Development Board published the TERS report that said we had more water under Montgomery County alone than there was in every lake in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana times 3. That argument went out the window, and then they jumped on subsidence. I don't want to get over there and argue why, because it was artificial. We already know that, but we also know that eventually we were going to have conjunctive use. So it was just way too early and way too big. The problem is we have it now. You can't make it go. I mean, we could make it go away, but it just seems
they've talked about mothballing.
So and then you brought up the notion of I can't hardly say socialism. But we have socialism already to some degree. So I live in a place where, we get we have the same asphalt roads, we have the same sewers, we have the same everything the city does. We get the fire department, we get all of this stuff, and we don't pay any more for it than a much poorer neighborhood down the road has to pay. Right? So we in some ways we subsidize them because our property values are higher. But it's the same road.
Sure.
Right? So I get that. Our income tax system is
right. It's a progressive tax system.
So we know that in this country people are willing to sacrifice complete equality, if you will, to help people who are less fortunate. And I see the water issue being, I don't like it, but it's a fact of life, and it's, quite frankly, most people feel that way, that it's worth doing some of that. But it seems to me like the people getting subsidized are the more affluent people.
That's what this differential.
That's what
it's
feels
kind of backwards.
like.
It's
I'm not saying anything bad about the woodland. I mean, I live in a probably more expensive home than a lot of people in the woodlands live in.
Right.
All right. So I'm not going down that road. What I'm talking about is that area, because they're served by the Woodlands Water Agency, they're getting a benefit that, I live pretty close to a neighborhood where the home values are less than $200,000. And those people, if they want to water their yard and use the same amount of water that I use, they're going to pay double or triple what the Woodlands people are going to pay for that same amount of water. And that just doesn't seem like that's what's caused this whole thing to be what it is. And it seems to me like this differential, or getting that right, could be a first easy step to, and I'm not saying quadruple the people in the Woodlands water bills, but look, if they're paying $90, they could pay $200. And if that took another $150 off my water bill, and I can afford my water bill. I'm not griping. But my point is, there are a lot of people who are having to make choices between whether I pay a water bill and water my yard, or whether I buy my kids school clothes
or medication
or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me like there's a place where some work could be done that probably doesn't need legislative fixes or any of that stuff, is the willingness to sit down and look at this differential and try to make this thing a little more equitable, if you will. Maybe I'm wrong, John. I don't know. I mean,
No, you're not wrong. I think that the differential definitely needs to be studied. And I think that they need to be more inclusive of more costs.
So why hasn't it been? Is it really?
Well, I honestly think that, it is better for the SGRA if that differential is lower because
they get more money.
They essentially, yeah. It's
and then so the other thing so the differential is a big deal, and the differential can also feed. I don't want to call it waste, but it is people not watching our dollars as closely as they could. So, the other thing I've heard a lot of griping about is the SGRA's office over there on the dam site.
Oh, it's nice, isn't it?
Big and ostentatious it is, and how do you pay for that? Well, maybe the differential is helping pay for that. I don't know.
Well, I think that a lot of that has been sort of included in what is called the administrative allocation that is picked up by the SGRA, or picked up by the GRP division of the SGRA. You see, the SGRA has a lot of different divisions. One of those divisions is their administrative division, and it's kind of like the division that takes in a lot of the overhead. And a lot of those overhead costs make their way into the GRP budget every year. And so I think that's going to be one of the keys to lowering the both rates, the fee for groundwater pumpage and the rate for surface water delivered, is that if we can cut some of the O&M, the operation and maintenance costs and the general administrative costs from that administrative division, we'll find a lot of savings and hopefully be able to get those rates lowered to something that is a little bit more palatable.
So if you end up cutting the cost and you end up finding a way to shift the differential, make the differential more real,
right,
and shift some of that, all of a sudden costs are not like this anymore. They're more like this. And that, to me, that it just seems so easy, really easy to do. I don't understand why it hadn't happened.
Yeah, and there's even an argument to be made that, for those 4 years or so, that the differential was 19 cents, but there was a lot of evidence saying it should have been 42 cents. A lot of people have argued that maybe the GRP should go back and try to recoup some of that, what is essentially lost revenue from the people that were receiving surface water. Another thing to also remember, Jim, is that the Woodlands water, specifically out of all the GRP participants, is now receiving a 50-50 blend of groundwater to surface water, where all the other surface water participants are paying 65-35 blend. And so you again see how this differential affects the people in the Woodlands a lot more than even the other surface water.
Yeah, so the more surface water you take, the more you get subsidized.
Right, the more savings you get.
So in reality,
not to mention all the maintenance and operation that goes into, maintaining those water lines that go down the 13 miles to South County, and then all the split offs, and there's a lot of extra maintenance, that goes in just with that, long of pipe that you have, and so they definitely, I believe, have an overall higher cost, yet their rates being subsidized quite much by an artificially low differential.
Yeah. Well, one other thing that I just want to, because I don't know, I'm over here on the groundwater side, but I had a meeting yesterday, and I want to give SGRA a plug. They were very cooperative. Had a really good meeting with Ed Shackelford and Chris Meeks. And they're actually going to give us a site. They were very gracious, very helpful to do coring samples so we can determine how much groundwater can we actually take out of the Jasper Aquifer, which is sort of our go-to aquifer now in Montgomery County. So a shout out to them for doing that. And I don't want to, I'm not trying to shoot holes at anybody, but I will tell you that GRP facility over there was, I was in awe when I drove up on it. I mean, it is unbelievable. And it kind of triggered a thought in my head. I know that the water conversion, surface water conversion plan was to have multiple phases.
Right.
Phase 1 was the water plant and the woodlands and Conroe.
Correct.
Right? Phase 2, I don't know what that was going to be, but I'm assuming it was to expand the network. Phase 3, further expansion. Phase 4, further expansion. I wonder if they built that GRP that whole complex, just like they did the water plant, build enough for all 5 phases at one time.
Right.
And that means that we are spending a tremendous amount of, I'm assuming.
Well, and you're just talking about facilities, but
Yeah.
also going into that mix was probably personnel. How many extra staffing positions do we have? Because we initially set out to create a much larger operation. Now that we see that large operation is not going to be realized, that we're probably just going to be staying with phase 1. Is there any chance for savings on personnel costs? You know, do we have too many engineers floating around
So
there?
a really good audit.
Or they call them efficiency consultants, or those.
A what? Efficiency? Somebody coming in
Yeah.
and taking a look at what are we actually spending money on? And
Right.
is there a way to trim some of that back? So you start to put that with the differential argument, you know, can we do a better job? All of a sudden, there's some serious, there could be some serious savings and a way to make that water plant more useful and more cost efficient to everybody. Because the last thing I think anybody in Montgomery County wants to see is that water plant to go away.
No,
I mean, it's, look, built way too early, built way too big in my opinion, but it's there.
it's there.
And so how do we, my number one, outside of managing groundwater, I'm going to continue to try to, do my part to, help the district get the highest practicable level of groundwater. And we're doing that with some science and all that. We're not going to do that PR-wise anymore. But the other thing that I'm concerned at as a citizen, and this is me speaking as a citizen on this show, I'm really concerned that we find a way to put this water plant to use in an equitable, efficient manner, and that we don't lose it. And that one of these days, I really do believe a phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, whatever is going to be necessary. I mean, I don't know whether we could take 200,000 acre feet out from under the county. I really don't yet until I get the science. But let's assume that we can. That only gets us to 2040, 2045. Can we take 400,000, which is the projection out to 2070, 2080? I don't know. I really don't. If we can, it's what we ought to be doing. But if we can't, we're going to have every source of water we can get our hands on.
And here's something else. And one of the benefits, I'll say, of the surface water treatment plant comes with the distribution center that we have.
Yeah.
And so something that you probably know a lot about is the Catahoula formation.
Yes.
That's actually below the Jasper.
Yes.
It's not really usable down in South County.
But it is up
But
north.
north of 105 in Montgomery County, it's actually the temperature that it comes out of the water is, it's around 100 degrees, so it needs to sit in.
I know up in Bentwater it's 97.
Right. And, the dissolved solids are a little bit higher. But it appears that, that is just a massive formation down there
water.
with
Yeah.
oceans of water.
Yeah.
And eventually, what I more than likely see happening is that eventually that surface water treatment plant, those lines that are running out of it might also be fitted to deliver Catahoula water from the north part of Montgomery County to the southern part of Montgomery County. I see that as being a very big possibility in 30 to 40 years. That, if they've, kind of gotten to a level where they've, sort of maxed out on their usage of those top surface level
Yeah,
aquifers.
so it doesn't matter what water you put in those, as long as it's treated, people
Right.
can use it. Doesn't matter where it comes from. I like the forward thinking on that. That makes a heck of a lot of sense. And I do truly believe that we're going to have to work together. And here's the problem I see. Nobody is taking the bull by the horns here.
No.
And this is going to sneak up on us.
I know.
And I really, I searched and searched and searched to think about who really ought to take this, who ought to be. I have not found an answer to that, right? So I can tell you the Commissioner's Court doesn't want to touch it.
Uh,
I can tell you our politicians, and once again, boy, have we been lucky in Montgomery County to have Will Metcalf, Brendan Creighton, Cecil Bell, Lois Colcourse, Betancourt, Ernest Bales, and the only reason I said him last
don't forget
is,
Steve. He'll get his feelings
and
hurt.
Steve Toth, absolutely. And I know Steve. The only one I don't know is I really don't know Paul very well, and I don't know Ernest very well.
Okay.
But I hear nothing but good things about him, and I've seen a lot of good things from him. But I don't see them seeing this as something for them to take on either.
Right, and that's something that water is not a sexy issue.
Yeah.
But I think Will Metcalf was right on the money when he had that quote, from Mark Twain, that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting.
There's no doubt about it. But I think the way to approach this is there are some pretty powerful people in Montgomery County who see this problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those people should sit down together and figure out who is it that needs to get involved in this because I don't see the SJRA, and I'm not throwing stones at them. They've got a job to do over there. They're operating. Their GRP, as far as they're concerned, is working for them.
Oh.
So, but who's the person that's gonna really get all the interested parties together and say, let's look at the O&M.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at the size of this GRP facility. Let's look at the differential. Let's look at these things and let's figure out, is there a way to bring some balance to this? Short of the antitrust lawsuit that everybody knows about,
Yeah.
going through and
some actual changes being handed down from a high level.
From high level, where those bonds on that plant go upside down.
Right. You'll see some real change then.
You'll
It might
see
not be the
and you
change
won't-
anybody wants.
And you won't like it, I believe,
No.
because it'll be strictly changed to save financial. When we could prevent all that by really doing some steps that I don't think hurt anybody.
No, I think
I think it's neutral, as far as I can see.
I think paying off those bonds as early as we possibly can is
Yes.
part of that answer.
Well, so let's assume there's $450 million in bonds left.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
Well, so if we could save $20 million a year,
Right.
that reduces the length of. You start paying an extra $20 million a year on those bonds, and all of a sudden the debt service gets smaller.
Right, it does.
And here's the other thing. Here's where the sense of urgency comes from for me. It doesn't come from the fact that I think we're going to run out of water anytime soon. I really don't. I think there's a lot more water to get out of the ground. The Catahoula's down there. The Jasper's not really been.
Right.
We're going to find out how much of that we can do. What really kind of bothers me is the fact that other sources of water that we might need are being taken while we're waiting. So one of the things I found out yesterday was we had originally, or the SJRA had originally been reserving 50,000 acre feet from the Trinity.
Right.
Well, they've been told they can't have that anymore. They can only have 25.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now all of a sudden that kind of
Yeah.
gets my attention. We had this and now we've lost it because somebody else has stepped in and taken it. And so how much of the water, Lake Houston, Lake Conroe, for example, is owned by.
City of Houston for the most part.
So the city of Houston could come in tomorrow and say, hold it a minute, boys.
Oh,
I'm not selling you this 100,000 acre reserve anymore. We're going to take that for the city. So I think waiting only hurts us in figuring out how can we use this equitably? Because once we can, then getting out and reserving and doing all these other things makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't know what's going to happen to that plant, we don't know how it's going to be used, it's really hard to justify spending. For example, I know SJRA is paying the city of Houston a couple of million a year
right.
just to reserve that 100,000 acre feet. And, if you take what we're pumping now and you add 100,000 to it,
Yeah.
that takes us out to 2040, 2045. We're good. But then that's even a short window, really.
Right.
2070 is going to be on us. I ain't going to be around to worry about it, but my grandkids and great grandkids are, and I don't want to leave them with that. So,
If I make it to 90, I might see 2070.
well, John, I really appreciate you coming on, and I think you've given a lot of clarity to this differential issue. More important than that, I really appreciate you bringing some insight into ways that we could actually begin to manage the cost more efficiently, more effectively, and more equitably, probably.
I think that's going to be the key.
And help save that plant. And I want to do a shout out to your boss, Mike Stecker, for allowing you to have the time not only to do the work, but to come here and talk to us about it. Really, I think it's really important stuff. He's a
Water is something that Mike's passionate about, not
Yep.
just because he owns a water and sewer company, but
His
he
kids.
generally cares
Yeah, he
and
does.
is
He
concerned.
does.
I
He
mean,
does.
for a guy that's a developer, I tease him and say, "You're
Yeah.
the biggest
and here's a
hippie
guy
tree
who
hugger
wants-
I know."
And here's a guy who I think has been put upon by everything that's happened, but also I think Mike wants to save that plant. I think Mike wants to find an equitable way to do it. So a big shout out to him.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate you coming in and
thank
us
you.
highlighting this stuff. So thank you very much.
I had a great time today.
All right. Thank you,
Thanks,
sir.
Jim.
You bet.